Hello everybody and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Our guest this week is Peter Dickinson from the Atlantic Council. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and go through the rundown of the latest stories straight out of Ukraine.
It was yet another week of Russian attacks on civilians in Ukraine. Sights like these are a daily reality for millions in the war-torn country. But there is no getting used to death, tragedy, and the loss of loved ones. On May 7th, Russian missiles and drones struck several cities across Ukraine. In Kiev, 2 people were killed, a mother and her son. 8 others were wounded, including 4 children. On the same day, a similar fate befell the Sumy region, which borders Russia. Attacks left 4 people dead, including 1 child, and 14 others wounded. Many other regions and cities were also struck, resulting in at least 20 civilian deaths and dozens of injuries. Ukraine stands by its proposal of a 30-day ceasefire, while the Kremlin has yet to respond to the offer.
Ukraine's proposal to cease strikes and establish at least a 30-day ceasefire remains in force. We are not withdrawing this offer, which could give diplomacy a chance. But from Russia, the world sees no response except for new strikes. This clearly and unmistakably demonstrates to everyone who really is the reason for the war going on.
Russia introduced its 3-day ceasefire on the occasion of the May 9th celebrations and immediately violated it. Ukrainian officials called it a farce, saying that between midnight and noon on May 8th, Russia violated the so-called V-Day ceasefire 734 times with attacks on cities and clashes on the front lines. "205 Ukrainian soldiers are now back home. The country's Prisoners of War Affairs organization said the returned POWs included 202 enlisted men and 3 officers from various units of the military and National Guard. The exchange was mediated by the United Arab Emirates, making it the 15th in a series of UAE-mediated prisoner swap agreements that have resulted in the release of more than 4,000 captives in total. This was the 5th swap this year and the 64th of the entire war. Ukraine's parliament voted in favor of ratifying a minerals deal signed with the United States. Kiev hopes that the agreement will secure future military assistance from Washington in support of its fight against Russian troops. Ukraine's first deputy prime minister, Yulia Sviridenko, referred to the document as a, quote, foundation of a new model of interaction with a key strategic partner. Previously, some lawmakers had expressed concerns over the lack of detail on certain provisions of the deal, but Sviridenko addressed a number of those questions at a morning presser, adding that the investment fund would be operational in a few weeks. 338 lawmakers voted in favor of ratifying the agreement, and none voted against. U.S. President Donald Trump has suggested that he may ask China to step in as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, as Washington seeks to secure a ceasefire in the military conflict.
President, will you be asking China to help you close, the gap between Ukraine and Russia?
I think so, yeah. I think it's a natural thing to ask.
What do you expect?
Sure. I don't know. I think we're making good progress. The fighting is a little bit different than it was. I think if we weren't involved, Russia would be going at it to maybe get the whole thing.
Poland's foreign minister Radosław Sikorski says either China or Turkey would be well placed to act as a mediator in the Ukraine conflict if the United States withdraws from talks to end the war.
Of course, we wish success to the United States on mediation efforts, but if that track fails, there are other candidates. There is Turkey, which keeps channels of communication, and then there is, above all, the People's Republic of China, which uniquely has the means to force Putin to the negotiating table and to moderate his demands.
In Lviv, European foreign ministers issued a joint statement celebrating the completion of technical legal work aimed at establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine at the Council of Europe. They reaffirmed that once the tribunal is established, its proceedings will be conducted in full compliance with international law and human rights standards as outlined in its statute. The Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe is set to meet in Luxembourg on May 13th and 14th to take further steps toward formalizing the establishment of the special tribunal.
And now to help us unpack the implications of these latest developments and explore what they mean for Ukraine's path towards ending the war, we're joined by Peter Dickinson, Ukraine editor at the Atlantic Council and a leading voice on Eastern European affairs. Peter, thank you for joining us on Ukraine this week. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Yes. Now, let's start off with this parade on May 9th taking place, the Victory Day parade in Moscow. This ceasefire was proposed in which Ukraine claims that it was immediately violated. There were a lot of questions as to whether Ukraine might send some of its outstanding long-range drones into the center of Moscow on that day. Do you think that Ukraine should have done something like this for effect, or was it better for them to not provoke the situation with so many leaders present at the parade?
Well, I think Ukraine did take advantage of the situation in a sense by saying that they couldn't guarantee the safety of visitors and creating a sense of uncertainty in Russia. I think it highlighted the fact that the Kremlin is not confident that it can defend Moscow's airspace, that it can defend Red Square and the Kremlin in the very heart of Russia. That was the assumption based on Putin's own request for a ceasefire. It was quite clear that his ceasefire was a parade ceasefire. He wanted simply to have protection for his parade. And so by creating this sense of uncertainty and sort of hinting that maybe they might do something, Ukraine added to that uncertainty and highlighted the fact that that Moscow is not safe, that Putin is not the all-powerful Tsar. He's not able to protect his own capital. Whether it would have been wise for Ukraine to actually go through with its threats and to carry out some sort of attack, I think is another question. Personally, I would say probably not. I think that the international response would have been fairly negative. Although technically speaking, a military parade is a legitimate target. The presence of a large number of foreign visitors, foreign dignitaries, foreign leaders, not least the Chinese president, but the president of Brazil, but many other heads of state, and also diplomats, large amounts of civilians. I think it would have been a very, very controversial attack, and of course the scope for it to go tragically wrong and for it to be a large civilian death toll, for example, would have been huge. So probably it would have been very risky, and the optics could have backfired on Ukraine. But I think Ukraine got a lot out of this little episode. Again, by creating uncertainty, they highlighted the fact that A, they have the potential to strike Moscow. They're well capable of doing that, and B, Russia. Putin is not able to protect the Russian capital. He's not able to throw a shield over Red Square, as it were, and so it underlined his vulnerability.
Now, we saw Chinese leader Xi Jinping attend this parade, and of course, a day earlier, they signed more agreements on closer cooperation between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and China and Russia. Do you believe that this is going to be troublesome, first of all, for the new Trump administration, especially in their, we heard this rapprochement with Russia. Does this sort of put the final nail in that coffin, at least for the Trump administration? And should they be taking note that rapprochement with Russia is a dead end?
Well, I think it underlines how unlikely that this so-called reverse Nixon is. The idea that by being generous to Russia, by ingratiating themselves with Russia, they can somehow problems away from the Chinese and bring Russia back toward the West. I mean, I think that was always a very fanciful notion. The alliance between China and Russia is in many respects a match made in heaven. It's like the ideal marriage of interests. China as a very, very large growing economy, which is hungry for resources, and Russia, which is a very resource-rich country, which is hungry for money and also economic, diplomatic support, military support. the two countries, there's a huge amount of synergies there, the huge amount of mutual interests there. And of course, they both share the fundamental interest of being anti-Western, of being interested in bringing down America and the West in general and establishing a new world order, a more multipolar world order. So there's an enormous amount of factors that are bringing Russia and China together. And the idea that America somehow pries them apart was always pretty much wishful thinking, in my opinion. But certainly this latest visit does underline that, does make it very clear, I think, to the Americans of how unlikely that split between China and Russia is. The alliance is stronger than ever, it would seem. The Chinese president was clearly the guest of honor at the Victory Day parade. He was clearly the top man on Red Square, and they've again signed a number of agreements which have further deepened ties. So I think the notion of an American reverse Nixon to split up China and Russia was always unlikely, but never more so than now. And I think that will send a clear message to the White House, and that was always one of the arguments put forward for adopting a more neutral stance toward Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or even a pro-Russian stance. Those arguments obviously now are also undermined.
Well, and this kind of brings us to a fork in the road in that, many experts for quite a long time now have been saying that Russia is constantly on the verge of economic collapse, and yet they continue, despite the sanctions, despite the vast economic pressure that has been put on the Kremlin. They continue to persist. Actually, they've proven themselves quite resilient from that point of view. And if we look at the economic realm, if you will, it seems that China will even back Russia, even if they get themselves into deep economic trouble. Then we have the military solution front, which is seemingly more and more, people are more and more vocal about the point that there's no military solution to this war. So what is the end game, in your opinion? Which direction do we need to head now here in the West?
Well, I think the White House has now discovered for itself in the last few months, I think, that Putin doesn't want peace at the moment. He sees no need to pursue peace in any serious sense. He maintains his very maximalist goals in Ukraine, which is essentially to extinguish Ukrainian statehood, to take over Ukraine in one form or another, either through a puppet administration in Kiev or through direct control. So essentially to extinguish Ukrainian independence and to force Ukraine very firmly back into the orbit. And something has to change in Putin's view of the war. He has to feel that the alternative to not seeking peace is defeat, and a defeat that will cost Russia very, very dearly. Now, at the moment, that doesn't look likely. So how to change that calculus, how to change the equation? Economic sanctions could potentially be helpful, could be a factor, but we've already seen a lot of sanctions put in place. As you mentioned, the Chinese are bankrolling the Russians to a significant degree. Russia has also found other markets for its exports, notably the Indians, and they seem to be quite resilient on the economic front in general. Plus, economic sanctions are also a very slow-moving, a slow-burning. It's not going to happen overnight. That certainly won't change Russia's position, I think, within the short to medium term. So, over the next year, for example, it's unlikely to have a massive impact on Putin's thinking. So we really need to change the situation in the military sphere. Many people say that there is no military solution. I would say that there's always a military solution. You just have to have the boldness and courage to pursue it. Ukraine has managed to inflict a number of defeats on the Russian forces. Russia's military achievements over the past 3 years and 3 years and 2 months of the invasion are also very modest. They've only managed to advance tens of kilometers from the start line of 2022, where the Russian army already was. They've not managed to seize and hold a single Ukrainian regional capital in all that time, and they've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So the Russian army is not some invincible superpower that is inevitably sort of, bulldozering victory. It is vulnerable. It can be defeated. Ukraine needs the tools to do that. Now, primarily, of course, it needs to have large amounts of things like drones and artillery, but it also needs more sophisticated weapons from the West and also the ability to use them. It needs to be able to bring the war back to Russia. I think it's absolutely crucial that Ukraine's Western partners provide Ukraine with the tools to strike and to strike hard inside Russia at long range, so they can hit the plants that are producing Russia's weapons and military equipment, so they can hit logistical hubs, air bases, military bases, and so on and so forth. If these steps were taken by Ukraine's partners in the coming months, and I'm looking here, of course, at the Americans, but also at the new Chancellor in Germany, the French, the British, the Poles, if these steps were taken, I think the military situation could look significantly different and significantly worse for the Russians. And at that point, I think if Putin was facing a resolute West, a determined and well-armed Ukraine, and with the prospect of suffering military setbacks, his position may well change. As it is, if Ukraine is simply playing defense, as it were, and fighting for survival and receiving sort of quite limited support from the West, of course Putin's going to say, you know what, I'm going to continue because he's not going to be influenced by his own losses per se. He's got a lot of people he can burn through, and he's not particularly worried about that. So we really need to change the military equation if we want Putin to change his thinking.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it all boils down to political will. We're still lacking this. And of course, we can't repeat the mistakes of the past, like this piecemeal approach which was taken since the full-scale invasion. I'd like to move on now. Kursk is essentially gone from Ukrainian control. I know that there are some units still on Russian territory, but not as significant as we saw since the summer incursion. And I'd like to ask you about what your opinion is on the future of North Korean soldiers. I mean, thus far they've stayed largely on, or essentially on, Russian territory, trying to defend Russian territory. What happens to them next when there is no combat missions on Russian territory to undertake? Is it possible, is it potential they could join the war on Ukrainian soil?
I think it's certainly possible. Yes, if we look at the way that Russia operates, they always test the water first. They test, they push, and they continue pushing and escalating until they meet a very firm response. Now, in the case of the North Korean soldiers, so far there's been almost no response from the West. We've had denunciations and comments, but there's been no really significant pushback to what is a watershed moment, the introduction of North Korean soldiers in large numbers in a European war, on the European battlefield. That's unprecedented, and there's been almost no pushback from the Europeans or from the Americans or from the West collectively. So I think that from that point of view, certainly in the Kremlin, they're going to be thinking, you know what, we can go further. Now, whether the North Koreans agree or not is another issue, but they'll probably also be encouraged by that. However, the North Koreans technically are being deployed as part of the military alliance between North Korea and Russia, which I think specifically stipulates that North Korean troops are able to participate in acts to defend Russia. So, although I doubt either North Korean and Russian dictators are not likely to be sticklers for the small print of documents, that may be a factor where they say, okay, we're going to keep the North Korean troops in Russia. But one option perhaps that they may choose would be to have North Korean troops take on border security roles along the Russian-Ukrainian border, and that of course would free up a large number of Russian troops from that role, who could then be deployed to Ukraine, for example. So there's different ways they can participate now. They don't have to necessarily actually go to the front lines in Ukraine, although that could happen. But even if they were simply to remain in Russia rather, in a defensive role, manning the borders, that would allow Russia to throw more troops into the meat grinder in Ukraine.
Right,
I
and
think
could that be
the least likely scenario of all would be for the North Koreans to retreat and to not participate anymore.
But could that be the impetus for the Europeans to do the same? We heard Emmanuel Macron for a long time proposing that NATO soldiers take the Belarusian border and free up Ukrainian forces there so that they can engage in combat activities in the east. So would that potentially be an impetus to get Europeans to move on that front?
It would certainly be another argument in favour of something along those lines. Yes, it would be a good argument. I think fundamentally, all the Europeans need in order to deploy troops to Ukraine is an invitation from Ukraine, which they have. If they don't have it yet officially, they'll have it. They'll have it as soon as they need it. They can have it tomorrow if they wish. Yes, certainly from a real politic point of view, they can certainly point to the North Korea and say, well, Russia didn't ask us if they could deploy North Koreans, so there's no reason for Ukraine to ask the Russians if they can invite the French and the British and whoever else wants to come. So I think the big about foreign troops in Ukraine, Western troops in Ukraine, is on what terms will they be deployed, and crucially, will they be able to fight? Will they have the right to fight? Because Putin will test them for sure. He'll look to put them under pressure. He'll look to inflict casualties. And at that point, are they going to fight back? Are they going to engage in combat roles? And will their governments allow them to do that? If they will do that, then of course we have a scenario that could potentially escalate. If they're not prepared to do that, then the question arises of what they're doing there. I mean, are they just observers? Are they human shields? Are they hostages? So that needs to be clarified, I think, before we get to the nitty-gritty of any deployments. And as far as I'm aware at this point, it's not being clarified. It's still very much an open question. So, the rules of engagement is the absolute key there. The arguments of why they can be deployed, I think, are clear and are very solid. But the key issue here is what would be the potential rules of engagement for any international force, any Western force in Ukraine.
Right, and of course, who would observe the ceasefire? And there are tons of questions there. We're not even to a ceasefire yet. The United States is considering backing out of the whole process and no longer committing to trying to get the two sides to sit down at the table. Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, said that Turkey and China could play a role if the U.S. steps out. The United States also mentioned China. Donald Trump's administration, if not Donald Trump himself, mentioned that China might be a good actor here. What's your opinion on that? Do you think that potentially Turkey and China should step up and try and mediate peace between Russia and Ukraine?
I think there could certainly be a role for a more international approach, yes. I mean, when we have America trying to broker a peace, I mean, Trump has tried to adopt a very neutral or even pro-Russian stance, but America, I think, fundamentally, of course, is seen certainly by the Russians as being the leading country of the West. Its principal enemy, essentially, principal rival internationally, at least. So I think it's a tall order for America to play kind of the role of the honest broker there. China would also suffer from that to a degree as being a very close ally of Russia. The Turks are very interesting in that respect, in the sense that President Erdogan and the Turkish government have maintained quite close ties and quite deep ties with both Ukraine and Russia. The Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey has stood up for Ukraine and has very extensive ties with Ukraine that have been developing a lot in the last decade or so, and has a lot of common interest with Ukraine, but at the same time has very deep ties, very strong economic relations, and a lot of common geopolitical interests with the Russians. So Turkey's a very interesting candidate there to potentially play a role. I would say Brazil also is an interesting potential candidate there that could play a role, which is more leaning towards the Russians, but perhaps not entirely in the Russian camp. And so you could get a situation where there's a number of countries involved in the efforts to try and broker some sort of a peace, and perhaps also to serve as monitors of a ceasefire. That could be crucial because, again, if we're talking about Western troops in Ukraine, they are not peacekeepers. They are pro-Ukrainian troops. They're on Ukraine's side, and that is clear to everybody. That's clear to the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the troops themselves. So we need to be clear that they're not peacekeepers. A peacekeeping force would need to be neutral and would need to be drawn from countries that are perceived to be, at least to a degree, with a degree of neutrality. Again, so we're talking about the likes of perhaps Turkey, perhaps Brazil, perhaps India, these sort of countries. They could all potentially play roles. Maybe China and America together could play roles in negotiating some sort of a ceasefire. I think that's probably a little bit of a tall order, maybe a bit of a fantasy. But these sort of formulas need to be explored now to try and get Russia to come to the table. I think ultimately, I would say my skepticism is not so much in terms of which countries could help broker a deal, is whether Russia wants a deal. Now, at the moment, for now, I think Russia does not want a deal. So a lot of this debate really is kind of academic.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way, and I think the Trump administration has definitely woken up to that. Well, Peter Dickinson, a Ukraine editor at the Atlantic Council, joining us from Kyiv. Thank you very much. I appreciate this conversation, and I appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have on Ukraine this week. Join us again next week for all the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.